Hello, everybody, and welcome to our in-session talk Unleashing Innovation. We have guests from 30 countries joining us today. Before we introduce you to our esteemed speakers, Nick, Inara, Judah, and Emma, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording on our event page at some point next week. And we invite you to ask questions by using the Q&A button. You can upvote the questions if you like. And we will endeavor to get through as many questions as we can, as time allows. And any remaining unanswered questions, we will try to get our speakers to answer and make them available on an event page. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. I'm going to hand you over to Nick, who is going to start today's conversation. Thank you.
Jo, thank you very much indeed. And a big thanks to all of our audience for joining us today from 30 different countries. I have to tell you that today is the hottest day of the year in the UK so far. So for those of you who might be watching this on a cold, rainy, wet day, believe me, we would love to have one of those right now as we're sweltering in 30 plus degrees here in the UK. I'm joined by a fantastic panel today. Emma Frost, who is the Director of Innovation, Sustainability and Community at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. Emma is also the chair of the UK Innovation District. So that's where all the cities look at their different innovation districts and all come together under Emma's guidance and good governance. Inara Khan, who is Head of Delivery for Innovation at NHSX. NHSX, the X is for experience. It's the experience that we as patients and all the other stakeholders get. It's that powerhouse of innovation within the NHS that has been able to respond so magnificently during the pandemic. Then we've got Judah Omani. Judah is an award-winning designer. His social enterprise, In-House Records, has transformed the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of prisoners, not only in the UK, but also around the world, in the United States, for instance, where in the Massachusetts penitentiary system, the service is now being rolled out across multiple prisons as well. And this is a record label that is created inside the prisons to help develop skills and capacity within the community there and help them get jobs when they leave. And you'll hear more about that from Judah. Now, as a kind of background into how and what this is all about from our perspective, you know, we've treated innovation for many years as a kind of luxury good, something you fund as a business in the good times when there's a little bit more money around. But as we begin to settle into the new normal in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and if this is the new normal, it's not really settled down that much yet, but innovation has clearly become a necessity for organizations big and small in the public sector, as well as in industry and commercial enterprise and social enterprise. What I'll be doing today is discussing this topic with Emma and Inara and Judah. We want to hear, and you'll hear about how they've delivered innovation strategies to help unleash innovation in their organizations, as well as with their customers, their business partners, and their supply chain. How all of this can come together. This is an incredible moment, and I'm reminded of the words of some marvelous words by Arundhati Roy, who talked of this being a moment, a portal into the future. And we can walk through it with little baggage, ready to imagine a new world and fight for it. Or we can carry all of the baggage of the past forward. Well, I think this is a moment when we need to really, truly unleash innovation. And we're going to have a discussion around that today. But before starting that discussion with you and with amongst our In Conversation panel here today, I'd like to introduce Inara first to just tell you a little bit about NHSX and herself and what they've been doing to innovate. And then we'll go to Emma, and then we'll go to Judah. So Inara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So as Nick said, I'm Inara Khan. I'm Head of Delivery for Innovation at NHSX, and we are the digital transformation arm of the NHS. So we do the frontline digitization, the technology, but also the back-end architecture stuff. So I'm sure, as you can all imagine, it's been a bit of a whirlwind over the past sort of 16 months. but I'm really excited to be here in such esteemed company. So I'll hand over to Emma.
Thanks very much, Inara. It's a bit unfortunate to have to follow you with a job like that over the last 16 months. You've been phenomenally busy, but hats off to you and all of your team. So tiny bit about me, but I have a background in community development. I've been involved in the Olympic and Paralympic legacy since before the bid stage, but always with a focus on the long-term commitments, not the games themselves. And I'm lucky enough to have seen through the various chapters of that story as it's evolved. My role's pretty special as it combines innovation, sustainability and communities. And I wish there were more roles that combine these elements, because I see them as really interconnected and essential to be thought of, in a very holistic way. But I consider myself very lucky to be somewhere that does understand the interrelated value of sustainability, innovation and community as one. And I'm incredibly lucky to be working in a place full of partners and opportunities about forwarding sort of inclusive innovation and purposeful innovation. In terms of what I think makes innovation so important right now in the current context, if we've seen anything over the last 18 months, it's been unprecedented levels of disruption. Probably not since World War II have we seen similar levels of disruption. And that's ideal breeding ground for innovation. So, things get thrown up in the air, systems and structures get shaken up and new ones can form. It's a bit like after an earthquake erupts, it leaves very, very fertile ground. So I think we are in an unprecedented moment with three interconnected challenges. There's the climate crisis, the health crisis, and the economic crisis. And each of those have exposed inequality that already existed, but is now being exacerbated. And you can't put that back in the box. We can't unsee what's now been seen. And I think that creates immense kind of fertile ground, as I say, for innovation, because the issues have been laid bare, but also we've got a remit for mission-led innovation. We need to focus on those big, wicked problems that need addressing through more inclusive innovation practice and through a focus on everyday innovation, not just high-tech, high-end innovation. And that's why I'm so passionate about seeing where we take innovation, the models that we use, and the opportunities that we need to unleash, now particularly. And I'll hand over to Judah.
Thank you, Emma and Inara, and also Dr. De Leon. Thank you for that intro. I feel like I'm in one of your classes still, but I'm not. So I have my own design practice focused on social change for the last decade and a half. And I grew up across a collection of unsafe spaces. So it's, I guess, natural that I'm drawn to working in unsafe spaces and co-creating innovative initiatives with those in challenging circumstances. And these initiatives have been deployed across, most recently, slums, castles, and prisons.
We can't just let you leave it at slums, castles, and prisons, Judah. You're going to have to unpack that just a little for us, because the questions I'm trying aren't going to hit that quite square on. And I want to know about the castles. That's a new one to me. You've obviously been visiting some very special places.
I mean, yeah, well, look, in essence, everything I do is pretty much the same. There's a combination of Trojan horses. So they look like one thing, but then they appear to be the next. The castles is a low cost, but high quality maintenance for castle owners, of which there are quite a few in Edinburgh. And, engaging with those who are on the fringe of society with a collection of homeless charities, providing routes on green therapy and qualification. The prisons, as you know, is around in-house records, which you gave a wonderful intro as ever for, and the slum communities was in Chennai, using football as a way of intervention and engaging young people back into education.
Fantastic. Well, look, you've got a marvelous panel. I'm going to kind of kick off this conversation because I was going to talk about how normal life seems to have been resumed in some ways, but and what are the lessons we might take forward. But it's clear right now that normal life is not resuming, and there isn't even a new supernormal resuming. I'm going to pick up on Emma's comment about, we can't unsee what we've seen. We've got this kind of confluence of a public health emergency, which is so overwhelming that we've done all kinds of incredible things that we never would have imagined the Treasury doing. But that is going to forebode the economic impact that's coming along. Meanwhile, we have a background leading up to COP26. And I should say the year 2050, which for many of you seems a mile away. Of course, the 2050, 28 and a half years, if you work 240 days a year, it's only about 6,600 working days to 2050. So for the young ones that are out there, you might be thinking 2050 is a long way. I'll be at the zenith of my career right now. Well, you only have 6,600 working days. And imagine living on 6,600 pounds, as some people will have to, or less, to year end. You'd watch every £5 note. You'd watch how you spent the equivalent of 1 week. So there's not much time. But I'm going to come back to this point of Emma's about what we can't unsee. We have seen that it's as though this placid, beautiful lake that we've been looking out on has been drained. And underneath, we found there are rusting shopping trolleys and old cars and all kinds of debris, because we have drained the lake of complacency to see what lies beneath our society by the pandemic. Those who have been really at the receiving end of challenges. We've now drained that lake, and we have seen that our society has some big systemic challenges that we cannot dodge. Just like the climate change issue, we cannot dodge it. It's there. So I'm just going to reflect and ask you to reflect on what are the lessons that you're going to take forward, because in academia, we spun on a sixpence in a way. If they'd asked us to go and give our lectures on Zoom like this, we would have said it'll take us 3 years to do that and probably not done it. But instead, we had 3 weeks, or we were basically out of business, so we had to do things. What is it that you've had to do? What lessons can you take forward from the last 8 or 16 months or so that are going to be long-lasting ones on how you innovate, what you innovate, and where you focus? Emma, do you want to kick us off on that one? Oh, we got you on mute still.
Sure, really happy to. Now I've figured out where the unmute button is. So the key things I would highlight, and others please do jump in, because I'm sure you've got just as much experience of these as I, but the first things I would say would be flexibility and adaptation, that very point that you've just made, Nick. For example, on the Olympic Park, we went from having a multi-story car park that became a major food bank distribution centre overnight, in literally one night. Similarly, Hobbs 3D Studio on the park changed their production line to make visors for care workers rather than 3D printing architecture models, which is their mainstay business. And then we've seen innovation or transformation and adaptation within business models themselves. So another example is a social enterprise that we work with an awful lot called Bikeworks, and they completely flipped their business model, normally around accessible cycling programs, to actually deliver a courier service door to door of emergency medicines and food supplies for those that were self-isolating. And off the back of that, so delivering 30,000 essential items to vulnerable people around the park. That then morphed into a new service that they established working with Imperial College and the NHS Trust there to deliver the first of the COVID test cases, when the first sort of lateral flow tests were first coming out. And that was a whole new kind of last mile delivery courier service in active travel that they hadn't really developed as a business before. So that flexible response and that quick adaptation was not only an initial community, let's do something good in a moment of crisis response, it then generated whole new business growth opportunities for them. And I think we can learn a lot about that willingness and aptitude to be flexible and adaptive in your outlook. That's certainly something I've taken away from the last 16 months. The other quick things I'd highlight would be the ability to think of innovation in the everyday economy, not just the sort of high-tech, high-end science world. A couple of the examples that have already been referenced this afternoon, but also thinking about how localized distribution for things like food, and medical supplies popped up on street corners. I myself was involved in setting up a food bank and running a food bank on the end of my road, so the innovation involved in the community activation there was quite phenomenal. And the importance of partnerships and trust, so really leaning on existing trust and relationships and partnerships and using those to understand how resilient you can be and what you can pull on when you need to. And I think those things have actually been real positives, and it is important to find the positives where we can and to not forget that they can build greater strengths in some of our innovation and business practice and community practice.
Did you also see within that different people stepping forward within your organization and other organizations? If you like, suddenly there were people from perhaps further down the food chain, as it were, who kind of suddenly stepped up. I just wondered, from a people perspective, did you find there were new behaviors emerging?
Yeah, we definitely did. You're absolutely right. It was kind of a call to action that people hadn't felt with such urgency before. So we did see new faces and new participants, and people pushing themselves, people, throwing themselves into stuff they'd never felt comfortable doing before because they felt they had to and they wanted to. They really wanted to have a kind of more of a frontline response. We also saw that actually the first movers, if you like, tended to be the micro businesses, the tiny enterprises, not always the social enterprises, but social enterprises that we do a lot of work with anyway, were incredibly fast to move and to respond. And they almost push some of the bigger businesses that are often a little bit slower to turn a big ship, but they kind of cultivated an energy and a commitment to wanting to do good and to respond in a constructive way.
Inara, the NHS could never, ever, ever be described as a micro business. And I just wonder, we've just heard from Emma about how, companies have flipped the products they produce, they've flipped their business models, they've flipped and designed and innovated new types of services, from lateral flow tests, which no doubt the NHS has been kind of the beneficiary of, as we all have, as well as community innovation taking place. What kind of has been your experience, particularly as a kind of macro business, but perhaps working with some of these micro businesses too?
So I think my first reflection is that people rise to challenges, and the outcome of that is innovation always. So the whole of the NHS, staff, patients, the central NHS was put in a very difficult position, but we've got through to the point that we're at now. Yes, the backlogs are huge, but there's the idiom that you can't fix a plane while it's in the sky. Well, the NHS had to be fixed while it's in the sky. And I think that what COVID actually offered was the opportunity for the sort of business as usual services, which downed tools at the beginning of the pandemic, to actually think about, okay, well, we've downed tools, now is our chance to think about how we can do things differently, because we haven't had that opportunity to be able to do that. And the only, there's two options to deliver a better NHS at the moment. One is more money and more resource, and the other is innovation with what you already have. And the more money and more resource isn't on the table, so people are having to rise to the challenges that are ahead of them. And then on the sort of models of delivery, we've completely changed from a predominantly paternalistic service to one where people are not treated in hospitals, where you have more things like virtual wards cropping up, where people are monitoring their own conditions at home, and that data is being sent to their clinicians to look at without having to turn up for routine appointments time after time. And that enables people to fit healthcare around their lives rather than the other way around. I think people who have experience of the NHS know that if you have an appointment in the afternoon, you have to take the whole of that afternoon off, because inevitably that appointment will be delayed. Whereas now you'll get a set time and you'll be called, or you'll dial into that call and be able to have that appointment without having to take the time out. So there's big sweeping changes in terms of the moves to video consultations and others, and also smaller changes within what you've described as a huge organization that are making a difference for staff. And they've all been driven by innovation. And going back to Emma's point, this isn't the big scientific sexy stuff, this is the smaller changes for a lot of people.
Yeah, has it also involved you working with new organizations outside the NHS as well? Because I assume a lot of these changes, particularly the way we engage with our GP, the way the hospital will book an appointment at a certain time, the modes of interaction these are not things that you can go to some of the kind of big corporate service providers and say, fix me up one of those, because it will be a 6 months requirements exercise followed by 12 months development and then disappointment 2 years later, or a big row in Parliament. I just wondered if there was, you've experienced that kind of shift of the lens, if you like, for innovation, moving to magnify and amplify the smaller organizations.
I think we have, and I think it's been in the sort of context of sort of anchor institution type relationships. So where local trusts have actually built relationships with local companies to provide services, and I think that's been on the community side of things as well, to support patients and support people going through a really difficult time, including NHS staff. When we look at the partnerships that developed to support NHS staff during this time, you look at free meals that were delivered to NHS staff, you look at things like Headspace that which were free to support the mental health of NHS staff, but also the more, you know, we've got local companies who are doing innovative things. How can they support the NHS? And there was almost a magic that happened, I think, between local partnerships and local NHS organisations striving towards something. You know, we will reflect on this period, I think, in the context of the sort of, you know, the Blitz spirit and the country coming together. And I think no more can you see that than in the partnerships that were built between organisations that before would have never crossed paths. So I'm actually quite excited to see what the legacy of that is, and how that now spurns into the next cycle of innovation and what happens, and it'll be interesting to see how we measure and quantify that.
It'd be interesting to see, I suppose, for all of us, whether we actually do take a moment to reflect on all those different things that have happened. I mean, hearing both of you describe those makes me think that, you know, every organization should kind of do an inventory of what we changed, what do we think would have been impossible, but we managed. What, you know, and to kind of not proceduralize, God, that's a ghastly word, but make it just, you know, part of our everyday innovation, to do some of the things that we thought were impossible, but those, you know, those shibboleths were kind of knocked over and we found we could do things.
I think it's a really good idea.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, well,
there will also be 1,000 PhDs written about this period as well, won't there? You can just feel it coming.
You know, I have to say, in an academic institution, I always champion the idea that people should do their PhD and do their research seriously. But actually, I'm sure there will be thousands of PhDs, but I think the ones that will be read the most are the ones inside organizations, Emma, like yours, between the different cities you work with and the innovation districts for Inara and within the NHS and the NHSX particularly, to look at what was it that we were able to do, and how did we manage to do it, and how do we actually preserve some of those elements. Now, Judah, in the prison service, of course, you know, there you were running so successfully across all of those prisons with a whole rollout plan for more and more prisons with the record label. I think, as I recollect, it was in about 7 at the time. You know, hundreds of prisoners working on it, and suddenly it was complete lockdown inside the prisons, complete, wasn't it? And no ins and outs. And you had to innovate really, really fast. So what are some of the lessons that you can take from that? Because I know what you did innovate ended up producing something else that was really quite incredible.
Thank you, yeah, for that. I guess the first part is to understand that innovation took place somewhere different on the spectrum. So it wasn't about creating ideas. Actually, there were a lot of those already out there. What was problematic was that fundamentally we're in a society that's based around competition, and innovation at its most successful is around collaboration. So there is a dichotomy there of how can we get more stakeholders around the table to genuinely feel passionately and have the appetite for wanting to create change. Of course, that became easier in the midst of the pandemic, but going back to your beautiful lake and trolley scenario, you know, there's when you have a stake in it, but there's latency and you're unaware of the time available, actually that stake doesn't seem to be so important. Look, we know if we drink plenty of water, eat fruit, get a lot of sleep, brush our teeth, exercise, we will increase our lives, right? We will live longer, and yet we all don't do it. There are many of us who don't. And that's about increasing our lives. So, you know, when we're talking about bringing into focus other bigger issues, actually, if the latency doesn't impact us in the way that COVID does, where it was actually imminent, so we needed to make changes, it's really difficult to create that collaboration. So that was a long way of me like landing the intro to your point. Yeah, we needed to find a different way to innovate, and that was by engaging with the stakeholders, by elegantly designing something co-creatively that everybody could see a stake in that. So we wanted to support the prisons in about being able to provide quality, engaging education. Absolutely wanted to support those in prison who are being, you know, locked up for almost 24 hours a day, and wanting to engage with those that wanted to make a difference, and those who were in prison and were connected with us. So, you know, we needed to have a better understanding of the stakeholders, but that element around collaboration and competition and how can you innovate in that space to make it attractive was the place that we found ourselves most operating in. And going back to your previous point, you know, this KDM model that I know Rizdi exploring, what are you going to keep, what are you going to delete, what are you going to modify from the past 18 months, is an approach that's very simplistic in terms, but actually really helpful, both, you know, in micro enterprises, but also in larger enterprises. Really simply, what is it that we are going to keep or delete or modify going forward?
It's really interesting, that kind of the RISD, the Center for Complexity that they have there. That, by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with RISD, it's the Rhode Island School of Design. It's very, very closely associated with MIT, who are quite close by. And the kind of innovation is a bit like the RCA working with Imperial, the Royal College of Art working with Imperial. It is RISD working closely with MIT. This keep, delete, modify, I think, you know, it's been used in the past for many businesses to think about their product line. What are we going to keep? What's going to leave the product line? And what are we going to modify? But in this case, it's much more about innovation itself, how we innovate. What are we going to keep of what's worked really well during this? What are we going to delete that was just getting in the bloody way before? And what do we need to refine as part of it? Now, Judah, I'm just going to stay with you for a moment, because you have a really good example of it, because, you know, the recording studios that you create in the prisons, the events, the distribution and marketing, the kind of outreach programs for crime prevention, they were all shut down, and you had to replace it with something. But this wasn't something you dreamed up on your own, was it? Explain a little bit about how that came about, and what came about, and how it came about through this kind of collaboration.
Well, I mean, as you know, because you taught me anyway, the innovation that we always explore is around genuine co-creation. So of course, stakeholders who are in the most challenging circumstances, but actually everybody that occupies the problem space, which means, again, being creative about how you bring people together. And I know you like using the kind of imagery of designers being like midwives or dinner hosts, being able to bring a range of people around the table. So we brought a range of people around the table in order to be able to overcome this challenge. And the point that I was making about actually there was very little innovative about it is that we was using tech that predates the birth of Christ. We used paper. And on that paper, we decided to create, as a group, we felt we could do some education by disguise, a music magazine that embedded, hardwired in there, was the core competencies that we see as fundamental to being able to find a way out of toxic networks and introduction to wider, more professional networks. The core competencies through journals and articles that are shaped every week on different genres of music that are selected by those in prison and those out of prison. So conceptually, there was nothing innovative, but actually what became innovative was the group emergence of this idea and how we were able to deploy it actually across 52% of the UK prisons that are still receiving the magazine on a weekly basis, full color, engaging in creativity and literacy, and there's a whole bunch of outcomes that came above that. But yes, you're right. The idea itself came pretty much like the record label. It came from a wide range of people that were part of that co-creation process. My role purely was as a host to push the conversation along as best possible.
Emma, I saw you nodding to some of that, and I just wonder if there were resonances in your organization too. And you know, as Judah described some of the barriers there a little, whether it was some of the barriers you had to overcome, but were there some resonances there?
Loads of resonance, and I just think that's such an excellent example, and the points kind of, they're applicable at every scale. So you give a perfect example of innovation within an organization and a service, you know, developing a whole new kind of music magazine that by stealth was helping people through education and learning that they didn't necessarily know they were getting. But that fundamental point about, it's about bringing diversity of voices and a collection of input ideas into the co-creation and the problem statement setting, and then the problem and solution refining process. That's true of an individual kind of product or service or organization. It's also true from a place-based point of view. And that's what's so exciting about the cluster of partners around places like the Olympic Park, because we're really playing that same convening role that Judah was playing, but amongst the private sector, big and small organizations, across the public sector, the academic sector, and really importantly, across the community sector as well, because the public sector doesn't always speak for the community sector. So it's so important that we've got that kind of quadruple helix of everybody feeling that they have a role to play, and knowing that there is an innovation space that welcomes them and their lived experience and their input, and we can breed that diversity of thought, because diversity makes us smarter, you know, and we need to be smart to innovate out of some of these mega challenges that we face.
Inara, it must be very similar for you. I mean, I can't imagine an organization that in many ways is more diverse and embraces diversity in the whole of our community than the NHS. But at the same time, I'm sure not only does everyone have an opinion and an idea of how it can be made better. How do you do that kind of convening, that bringing together? And are there any kind of hiccups on the way or barriers you have to overcome in doing that?
So I'm going to go back a few steps to what you're saying about draining the lake. And I think what COVID gave us, well, at least the NHS, is that once the lake was drained, we could look up. And we were already working with the same stakeholders all the time. And yes, they were diverse, but actually they were diverse maybe 10 years ago. And I think what the last sort of 16 or however many months it's been has given us is the ability to sort of stick our heads above the parapet a bit more and look beyond sort of our immediate diversity. So, you know, you can see that in the types of suppliers that the NHS worked with. So it wasn't just your sort of big health tech companies or others, it was smaller organizations. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement happened not long into the pandemic, and that made us in the NHS really assess whether we were truly a national health service for everyone, and there's a homogenous patient voice that comes through, but actually should we be breaking that down? Should we be looking into specific cohorts and their issues? And you know, I'm leading a piece of work on digital inclusion now for specific cohorts of, I'm not saying patients, but I'm saying people, because they're people before they become patients, and actually that's where we need to be looking at people, especially when it comes to things like digital inclusion. So I think you know, there has been a bit of an awakening and a bit of a sort of mirror held up to us in the NHS about how diverse was our convening up until that point. And I think, you know, we're lucky in the NHS because, you know, we're a global brand, whether we want to be or not. We don't seek to be one, but we are. So people do come to us and come to talk to us, but actually are they the right kind of people that we should be having conversations with, that's actually going to lead to true innovation, not just innovation in the same way we've been doing it for the past 5-10 years. And I think one of the points that stays with me is that in the NHS we've taken a massive leap during the pandemic. But where people's headspaces are now, actually we need them to be where they need to be in 5 years' time, not where they are now. And you know, clinicians, patients, everyone else. So that's what we need to be thinking about. What we've got to now is what's innovative for the moment, but we need to convene an even more diverse set of stakeholders to think about what's the horizon scanning we need to do for where we're going to be as a nation in the next sort of 3, 4, 5 years.
I suppose, particularly with the NHS, I mean, that degree as well of innovation now required to cope once we move past the crisis of the summer and autumn, which no doubt assuming that the projections from Imperial College and the others are right, we then have probably 2 or 3 years of backlog clearing before we can really even move on. And do you see any barriers for you in terms of bringing more resources on board?
So I think, the NHS is a political football, whether we want it to be or not. So there is the politics of the NHS. Yes, we're often told there's more money going in, there's more resource going in, but there's also money being drained and there's resource coming out of the NHS, and we have seen that I'd say exacerbated in the last year, especially with you look at nursing staff and clinical staff who are overwhelmed. So we're going to have to really think about that, I think, in the next few years. I think we've got a bit of a battle on our hands when it comes to the public as well, because the NHS is almost the nation's sweetheart as well. So what we let fly with the NHS, where it takes 18 to 21 weeks to get an appointment. If you wanted to speak to your bank manager and they said to you it's going to be 18 to 21 weeks to have an appointment with your bank manager, you wouldn't stand for it. But I think, as you said, as the backlog continues to get bigger, I think the public will start to question more and more what are our taxes going towards? How is this working? And that's the space where we will need to innovate. So yeah, I think there are sort of your physical resources, and I think there are certain constraints around the nature of the NHS and what it is that are going to come to define people's relationship with the NHS and how it operates. And again, I think that's a space that innovation needs to operate in to bring us back to some sort of normality. And when I say normality is still waiting lists that are longer than they should be.
Yeah, no, many challenges ahead, but as you say, the NHS is the sweetheart, but it wants to stay in that position going forward, and that is a complex set of issues. Now, I know we've got a few questions coming in from our audience. So, Joe, I'm going to turn over to you because I think you've got a few questions from our audience, which I think we can parcel out between us all. But Joe, what have we got coming in?
Thanks, Nick. The first question is from Musari Jane. Sorry if I actually butchered the name. In a moment of uncertainty for many businesses, how might one help them justify investment in innovation, inclusion, and community, while this has traditionally been something that they think about in good times of surplus?
Oh, Emma, I'm going to go to you first on this one. With that combination of your quadruple helix, bring the public sector, the community, the government and academia together. So what are your reflections on it? Because you've got all of that at Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, of course.
Yeah, we do. And it's a really good question. And I'm hoping that it's one that we have to sort of push against less and less, because increasingly what I see with many of the organizations I'm working with is quite a sort of fundamental understanding of what makes good business sense. And that point about that you made right at the top as well, innovation shouldn't be spared for just the good times. In fact, if anything, innovation should be really focused on when times are rough and when the challenges are presented, because that's when you can generate the most fruits, the best kind of return. You need that sort of pressure cooker moment of something's not right and there's real need to fix it and to respond accordingly, and that can generate the kind of the best results. So I do see that more organizations are recognizing the inherent worth and the business value of innovation practice as part of their mindset, rather than like an add-on to someone's role. It's core to your business strategy and it's core to your kind of business model practice and philosophy. And equally, I think the very same needs to be true of diversity, and understanding that your skills and your talent pipeline and your workforce, diversity does breed the sort of essential business strengths, if you like, that forward-thinking organizations need if they're going to compete in a global market, and if they're going to be able to respond to the pressing challenges of our time. And I do think we've seen through the rise of more organizations thinking about how they weave in things like the Sustainability Development Goals or ESGs, and they're using those in their investment decision making. So it's part of their financial boardroom quantification now, just as hopefully in the not too distant future, shadow carbon pricing will be. Businesses now seem to have a much more holistic and comprehensive understanding of what good business practice needs to be. And that's not about CSR. We fundamentally shifted away from doing good to just being a better business. And that's so that you can see your bottom sort of triple line return as a better business model, not because it makes you feel warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well when you mention ESG or environmental social governance, these investment funds and companies also signing up to these principles are being, if you like, many of the investment or the investment banks will have up to about 40% of their business now in ESG-based funds because that's what their investors are demanding. And also impact investment has risen by something like sevenfold in a handful of years. I mean, this would indicate to me that the money is chasing innovation. And the economists would tell us we are in a 60-year cycle of innovation, a Kondratiev wave of innovation right now. So if you're in a business, I would say, that doesn't get it, for goodness sake, go and find another company, because you're not going to be around very long. So anyway,
good advice. Yeah.
Can we have another question? I'll throw this one. Well, let's see what it comes up with, Joe, because we want to get through these questions for our audience. Joe, what have we got?
Next one is from Hannah Sophia. Good point from Judah about innovation thriving with collaboration rather than competition, genuine co-creation. Question for Inara Khan. How do we overcome the challenge of inequalities in access to medical services when the focus is all on digital?
Whoa.
Judah, do you want to? I don't know if you want to comment on the first part before I jump in.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, look, my experience is limited and certainly not as broad as Emma's and Inara's, but within my limited space, I think it's prudent to understand the culture of which you are exploring innovation in. Fundamentally, I have to accept that the culture that I place the innovation that I choose to work in, the prison culture, really is about answering one question. Do you believe in change? Do you believe people can change? If the answer is no, then we are subscribing to punishment, which we kind of have done ever since the Romans left. If the answer is yes, then we see a completely different approach to what transformation can look like. And we can look at the typical forward-thinking Scandinavian examples of where, rehabilitation has a different narrative. But I think it's really important to look at culture and what can you expect in terms of appetite and capacity within that? Because whereas I might have an opinion of what innovation could be with stakeholders, I'm also acutely aware that there is limitations on what that can be unless there is culture shift. And whether I want to deploy the innovation as part of that shift in culture or want to make what exists better, I think is quite an important process to go through.
Now to the digital bit, Inara.
Yeah. So this is the question we come back to time and time again. And I think the answer is that digital is always a choice. It's not the only option. It's appropriate for some people and for some people it isn't. And I think there's a few different ways we can think about this. So I think one, when products and services are designed, you need to really understand who you're designing them for. And I think when that comes to products and services within the healthcare environment, that's understanding the cohorts of people that suffer from the condition that you're trying to design something for. So for example, diabetes, we know that the AME communities have higher instances of diabetes. So if you are developing a product that is aimed at the diabetes market, how are you ensuring that it can be used by people who come from non-white backgrounds? So that might be in the education around that product. How are you implementing and embedding it? What are the conversations that people are having? What languages are they having them in? So I think first point is that it's a choice. The second point is that when you are thinking about products and services that are used in the NHS, think about who is going to be using them and drill down into your cohorts. I think there's often misconceptions about digital that it's old people who don't want to engage. That's not what we've seen from our research. Actually, I think you need to again drill down into your cohorts. Now we're seeing, for example, maternity services. There's an app where if you're worried about something to do with either your pregnancy or your newborn baby, you can, log a question into the app, and you can find answers to that without having to call NHS 111, without having to call your local hospital. And actually, that's great because it alleviates the concern for the parent, but also doesn't put pressure on NHS services. But then, you have to think about the fact, so I am also a trustee of a charity in North London that provides community sort of maternity support for people for whom English is not their first language. So one of the first questions I would ask would be, okay, well, if you want to deploy this in, for example, areas of North London that have a high Somali community that have a high birth rate, how are you considering that as part of the design? So I think there's a lot of questions that we need to ask ourselves when it comes to digital inclusion and exclusion, but also recognise that we're not going to shift the whole of healthcare to a digital approach, because it just cannot be done. If you have a lump or a bump, you cannot turn up to your GP via a virtual phone call and they can say, oh, that's 100% not a cancer risk. You have to turn up and they have to examine you, and that is always going to be the way. And it's making sure that clinicians have enough time to provide the right level of care, rather than dealing with the stuff that they don't need to see, and actually having the time to deal with the stuff that they can see. And innovation in digital is a key way for us to be able to do that.
Thank you so much indeed, Inara, on that. Now, Joe, what have we got coming up next? I can see there's a lot of questions here, and we're going to try and rattle through as many as we can.
Yes, thank you, Nick. We have our next question is from Kester Moore, who is actually one of our short courses alumni. There is no doubt that the global pandemic has led to a lot of innovation, maybe a lot driven by people needing to overcome pandemic-related problems for themselves, their organizations, or for others. But as the pandemic hopefully recedes, what can we learn about how to unlock innovation? Is it about presenting an opportunity or a problem to people and seeking ideas? And if so, do we expect people to give their ideas for free to keep their job? Or is there a better way?
Okay, I'm going to, again, I'll come back to this and answer some of it myself, but I'm going to keep Inara in the frame right now, if that's all right, Inara. Would you like to just comment on this one? Because, of course, you've had to go out and you are one of our Open Innovation Fellows. London and Partners, who the Mayor's Office have kind of anointed you in this way, and I was lucky enough to give a few talks on this program as well. So do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so innovation is about coming together. It's about collaboration. I think there's something about the space in which that collaboration happens, and whether it's formal or informal. But I'd like to pick up on the idea of people giving their ideas for free. So an idea often isn't something that just pops out of your head like that. It is something that you've thought about, has come from other conversations, and it's something that's percolated and come from experience. And there's a value to that, and there's a value that we can place on that. I think in the NHS, people have come to us for free with ideas, with products, with things that we can use over the past however many months. But I don't think there should be an expectation that those things will continue to be provided for free, because there's a cost to that thinking, there's a cost to that experience. And if that then leads to, for example, savings within the NHS, or if in a corporate setting it leads to something else, then yeah, there should be a value attached to that. But that shouldn't preclude people coming together to have those sparky ideas and conversations that leads to innovation.
I mean, I was going to say a good example of this to me, Judah, is you had this idea that it would be great to run a record label inside a prison. Now, you could have sent that to, who was it, prisons minister at the time, Rory Stewart, and said, Rory, got a great idea here, why don't you run with it? And you could have given the idea for free, but nothing would have happened. Instead, you got involved and co-created it with the organization. But then you couldn't give your time for free. You couldn't run it without it being economically sustainable. You had to identify what were the budgets that could be redirected inside the prison service for training, for work experience, that could be remission to support it. And as a result, create an enterprise. So do you want to just comment a little bit on this? Because again, I think, here are you as an innovator bringing an idea to an organization. And Emma, it would be interesting to hear it kind of the other way around, whereas an organization, you are soliciting ideas. But Judah, what your reflections on that?
So, I mean, my reflections on the point you just said, and then my reflections on the question as well. On the point you just said, it was absolutely about finding the pain points for the different stakeholders. Until that point, until those pain points were identified, actually, it was just another idea about how this can make a difference. But there's a ton of those sitting on a desk somewhere, and that. Unless they actually begin to make sense to a wider stakeholder group that can engage with some real value exchanges, then it becomes really difficult. So certainly for in-house is about elegantly understanding, or hopefully elegantly, I'd like to think it was, is about understanding what are the pain points for the various different stakeholders and how can we position something that actually makes sense and creates value, different kinds of value to that which I wanted to see, which is a reduction in the offending, but accepting that, part of what you need to do is create some kind of a Trojan horse that does multiple things. In answer to, or certainly from my limited capacity in answering to that question, it is, I mean, look, let's be clear on this. The pandemic, we went through an incredible, innovative, co-creative space because everybody had a stake in it. Okay, if suddenly tomorrow they realize that poverty was catching, we probably have an equally strong stake in wanting to solve that, but it isn't, and we don't. So I think we should really be clear about the latency and the time and the personal stake we had in it. So innovation, of course, we know it happens really well in squeeze. That's a part of the reason, if I'm being completely honest, why I'm drawn to challenging spaces and challenging circumstances, because in those unsafe spaces, there is the possibility for innovation to bloom in ways that it's not so easy. But we shouldn't be blind to the fact that when personal stake is wider, it increases the potential for that to happen.
Yeah, really insightful. Thank you so much. Emma, would you like to comment on that one before we turn what probably might be to our last question?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just picking up on what Judah said. I think that's a really good reflection that the personal stake is so key, and actually part of what we need to be taking past the kind of pandemic is understanding how we see and how we involve different people to really understand their personal stake. Like, what are the pain points for them? What are the pressures that they're dealing with or responding to? And how can we create, as Judah says, those collaborative spaces and processes whereby you might be able to solve multiple people's problems, with the same solution. Like, that's where co-creation really can unlock unseen opportunities. And it is a process, and that takes immense skill. That takes a lot of time, huge dedication, and a fair amount of resource and funding and commitment to see it through. So one of the takeaways I'd really want to stress, as simple as it sounds, is innovation doesn't happen by accident. And innovation is way more than ideation. So it's not just about having that idea spark moment. Innovation is what you said, Nick. It's the struggle, it's the turmoil and the ongoing iterative process, the check and the challenge, the debating things, coming back to things, scoring them out, trying again, testing them, refining. That's blooming hard work. But that's what derives better results and better practices and better solutions. It's way more than the idea stage. So yes, we need to invite really, really good ideas, and we need to stimulate that ideation phase, and we need to diversify the pool of who gets to set the agenda on what we should be innovating and how, and we need to support different users to be involved in that rigorous innovation process. But we also need to fund, with really good skills, with really good investment, with really good understanding. You need to invest in that innovation process and mindset itself, because it doesn't happen by accident, as I say.
I think that's a great way of kind of wrapping up that one. I'm always remember H.L. Mencken, who wrote, "For every complex problem, there's always a simple solution, and each time it's wrong." But let me kind of match that with another quote, which is, and I can't remember who came up with this, but elegance is the resolution of complexity with seeming simplicity. And I think this points us to the fact that most complex issues involve a lot of different stakeholders, a clash of technological systems, social systems, cultural systems, and economic systems, and you have to bring them together. But when you're able to find that sweet spot where all those intersect, that can seem so simple. People say, why didn't anyone think of it before? Well, they couldn't have done until that moment. So that's another little definition. Now, we've got time for one last question. So Joe, what's our last question before we get our lights turned off and the meter runs out at 5 o'clock?
Yes, thank you, Nick. The last one is from Sabrina. I would be really interested to hear the panel's views on how we can approach the research behind new innovations to better support those from different walks of life. We know the lens of research and how this is conducted is very problematic.
Right. A moment each, because we only have 4 minutes left on this. Who would like to go first? Judah.
So this will be a completely maverick response, so probably no one pay attention to this. But my own approach to that is I operate with theories of change for a very, very, very short amount of time because I like to see them in actual change. So I like prototyping. So the research is raw. I like to refine it and then create some insights and then prototype it as quickly as possible to see whether actually those assumptions are real or not. But I appreciate that could be problematic for many reasons, but much to Nick's disappointment over 2 years, I was quickly into trying to do things as opposed to going through the right process.
I think that's exactly the right process.
The research. Emma, sorry.
No, I was just going to agree with Judah, actually. I think that is the right process. You learn through doing, and you can spend an awful lot of time, and you should, reflecting on that, almost like post hoc, like really reanalyzing what it is you've done. But the actual learning is often through the process of doing.
Well, I'm going to go to Inara so I can have the last word on this.
So hello to Sabrina, who I believe used to work in my team when I worked in the NHS Cancer Programme, and great question. On the different walks of life bit, I think we have to be really clear about who we work with when we're doing this research. So if I think about medical research, I think about innovative sort of medical device research, we have to be really clear on the questions we ask about who have you spoken to, who have you tested, what you have done with, and who do they represent? Do they represent the whole of the population? Do they just represent a small segment? And we have to be really clear about in the NHS, our commitment to equality and diversity needs to be shared by those that we work with. And that's the only way that's going to lead to delivery that actually aligns with our values. So I think there's questions that we need to ask about research and who's doing that research and who are they doing it with.
Yeah, I'm going to bring it around to supporting people from different walks of life. Unless you have the same level of diversity in your team doing the innovation as the people that you're trying to serve with it, the chances are you're going to come up with the wrong solution, because you cannot walk a mile in someone else's shoes if you cannot associate yourself with their lives. I think we tend to kind of sprinkle empathy dust on people, not really get into real empathy. And to be empathic, you need that diversity inside your team to make all of that possible. So with those words, I'm going to thank our fabulous panel today. Emma, absolutely brilliant. Thank you. Inara, Judah. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. Let's give a big round of applause to all of our participants who's joined us on this journey today. And also to Hattie and Joe and Peter, who kind of made it all possible. I'm going to turn back to Joe to do a little bit of a wrap, but I'm also going to say, if you want to know more about Unleashing Innovation, go to our website and we'll send you a link right now. We're even going to have a course on how to unleash innovation inside your organization. We've got 65 people listening. We've got 8 of us. That's 57 of you can come on our first course, or at least go and explore it, investigate it. And for the hundreds of people who are doing it later and listening to this later, please go on to another link that we'll be sending you. Okay, Joe, over to you for our last 30 seconds or so.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Inara. Thank you, Judah and Emma. Thank you, all of our attendees as well for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and expertise. And to everyone who joined us in this session. If you have any additional questions or would like to connect directly with the executive education team and or the speakers, please use the contact information on the slide that you see on your screens. Please follow us on social media at RCA Short Courses on Twitter and Instagram, and make sure to check our event webpage for upcoming in-session talks and how to register for free at the link. Yeah, and thank you very much for your time. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.